Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalyagin, and we have a fantastic and packed show for you this week. Of course, some big things are probably going to happen pretty soon after we record this, so expect two back-to-back shows this week and next week. That's what I anticipate. We've got these big Iranian response strikes coming. We're going to talk about all of that. We have the solar eclipse happening on Monday, April 8th. We have big things happening across all the continents, South America, the Middle East, Europe, even Africa. At this point, we're going to talk about Ethiopia and Somalia. We've got developments with Cyprus, Armenia, Azerbaijan. Of course, there's the UAE and ceasing their cooperations with Israel. There's some stuff going on in Greece with the gay marriage stuff still. Of course, there's the red heifer things that are being discussed all over the internet. So we're going to be talking about all of this and more. Dmitry, how are you doing?
Doing great, Conrad. Of course, a very heated discussion around the eclipse and what's happening in the Middle East currently. And of course, just sort of beginning our journey in the Holy Land this week. Some of the news, I think the news which really broke, I guess, some of the, the tension in the Western world, or at least the status quo sort of, oh, Israel is right, Hamas and Palestine are the bad guys in this situation, when, of course, the status quo was broken by indiscriminate or maybe even targeted, shall we say, Israeli bombing of essentially a food NGO type project. So there was a series of free cars traveling along the coast of Gaza, providing food. And these are international workers, mostly from European countries such as the UK, Poland. There was even an Australian involved in this project. So these are just casual civilians traveling along the coast of Gaza, providing food to the starving Palestinians. Now, the stories we covered for the last couple of weeks, where it turns out Palestinians are actually beginning to starve en masse, including first and foremost the children who are just having major dietary issues. People are dying of disease, as well as just simply, just the lack of nutrition. So here we have these kind people coming from abroad, risking their lives, their livelihoods, and I suppose even their health, supporting these Palestinian people. No weapons at all, and even their cars, Conrad. What I've noticed is the cars of these health and food provision workers actually had the sticker of the organization on the roofs. So no drone, no Israeli drone or plane or any sort of even Israeli satellite, for example, could even spot them and sort of misconstrue them for like a Hamas vehicle of any sort. But no, these three vehicles in separate spots, almost 500 meters to a kilometer apart from each other, were bombed by Israeli military planes, and all those people were killed. Of course, this is like a huge tragedy because for the first time we have like Westerners killed all at the same time, and Israel provides almost no answer except for, well, I'm sorry, it was an accident. We didn't know, like, we're not sure why we targeted these people. So, one of the folks from this relief team was actually a Palestinian, aged only 25. So these are quite young people who, I guess, these 7 folks who have been killed by the Israeli army. They're quite young, very eager to go out and actually save Palestinian lives, essentially putting their lives on the line. And it's just this sort of tragedy is what forced Western governments, like we saw the government in Australia, we saw the government in Poland, the Polish president Duda came out and said, well, Israel needs to investigate this. And it's like, the question is, Conrad, like, we've been seeing bombing indiscriminately, violently of Palestinian targets, civilian targets for months now, and yet it takes one of your own to pass and perish until suddenly concern comes up, and wow, all these international powerful statements are being made. Even Rishi Sunak from the UK comes out and sort of condemns Israeli action. It's like, hello, Rishi Sunak, haven't you been realizing what's been happening for the past 6 months with all the Palestinian children being killed? It's just really sad that it takes, and I mean, this is the selfishness of international politics, right? It's like it takes a certain country for hostages to be taken, for these people being killed, of course, intentionally, you can say, by Israeli planes, for them to finally notice that there's a genocide happening on the ground.
It's a real tragedy, and those excuses that have been made by the Israelis that it was a Hamas bomb on the ground or a mine or something are ridiculous. And before we dive a bit more into the whole situation in the Holy Land on that topic, be sure to listen to our recent Ether Hour with Lucas Gage. We talk all about the fight against Zionism, specifically online, and how the message is reaching the whole world, and not just like the watered down anti-Zionism of the left, but like the real, full-throated anti-Zionism, being against, the synagogue of Satan in that regard. So be sure to check that out. It'll be in the links down in the description below on Substack and YouTube. And while we're still on this issue, be sure to follow World War Now Clips. That's at WWN Clips on Twitter and X. And you can also search at World War Now clips on YouTube, and the channel will show up. We've got some fans and some good friends helping make some great clips of the show. So if you want that shorter, digestible content to send to people, to red pill them or anything like that, be sure to check out World War Now clips. Again, that's at WWN clips on Twitter. Be sure to share that, follow it, boost that account. It'll really help us out. So thank you so much to the people that have put that together. But back to Israel and Gaza and everything. Yeah, the whole world has really kind of realized that Israel needs to fight some of its own battles here with these responses, because at the same time as they're bombing these World Kitchen aid workers from all over the world, they're also bombing the Iranian consulate in Damascus and killing IRGC generals and Hezbollah members and a whole bunch of high-ranking officials in the axis of resistance against Israel. And in response to this, the U.S. has basically said that Israel's going to have to bear whatever response Iran gives to this on its own. And Iran has pledged heavy responses. They've the cover of some main Iranian Quds Forces magazine said, the storm is coming, all these sorts of things. But in the airstrike, General Mohammad Reza Zaheti, who leads the Quds Force in Lebanon and Syria, he was killed, as was IRGC General Mohammed Hadi Khajrahimi, and then, of course, a member of Hezbollah, Hussein Youssef, as well as some other members of Hezbollah, IRGC, and other militia members around the Iranian sphere of influence across the Middle East and the Shia Crescent. But yeah, this is a huge escalation from Israel. Of course, we've discussed how Israel is clearly trying to goad Iran into such a strong response, where the U.S. is basically forced into war with Iran, or at the very least to strike and destroy their nuclear capabilities, as Metropolitan Neophytos has been discussing for years now. But at the end of the day, the U.S. seems at least to want to present like it isn't approving of what Israel is doing anymore, especially with these two big escalations back to back, the killing of the aid workers and then this diplomatic escalation and striking a consulate. We're going to talk about some consulate issues with Ecuador and Mexico later, but this is really big. There's rumors that April 8th, the day of the eclipse, which is also a relevant date nearing the end of Ramadan here, that may be when the Iranians strike. And listen to our discussion with Lucas. Again, we talk about best case scenario, worst case scenario. Of course, we've all been a little disappointed with Iran's responses up until this point. But, perhaps they really strike Israel's Air Force. Perhaps they hit the red heifers. What if they just blew up the farm in Shiloh where the red heifers are being protected and kept? We're going to talk more about that later. But regardless, it's something that we're all bracing for. It could be what marks a really new era in the ongoing Third World War that we've been covering, because like we've said, this is apocalyptic eschatological stuff. We're not getting Protestant about the eclipse or anything like that, but it's starting to seem like, we are in that era. They say you won't know the day or the hour like the scriptures say, but perhaps maybe we'll know the century, and it's starting to feel more and more like that. We, of course, have the impending Rafah invasion, which has already really begun in some capacity. The airstrikes have increased. There's been probing attacks. But of course, we've also heard about the impending invasion of Lebanon, which the Israeli authorities have effectively said will occur once the Rafah invasion is over. So, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on all of these escalations. It's really heating up, and it's a bit frightening, frankly.
Yeah, well, you say when people call, for example, Russians warmongers or Americans warmongers, what they don't realize is the most warmongering country in the world at the moment, and that's not even Russia or Ukraine, I would even say. It would probably be Israel, who's essentially conducting anti-state actions both in Syria, Lebanon, and in Palestine at the moment, which it knows these territories belong to Palestinians, yet it's still conducting military conflict and essentially free territories at once. And bombing of the embassy in Syria was essentially a strike too far. And Israel knows this. They know exactly which targets they're hitting, and of course, hitting an embassy like this, hitting top Iranian officials. I mean, it's really interesting that Israel actually thinks that the U.S. will probably support it, even for these irrational actions leading to potentially, and I think, if anything, this has been the closest we've been to a third world war over the past year and a half. I mean, this is crazy. The fact that it's aligning with the eclipse and the end of Ramadan and everything else in combination, of course, with the impending invasion of Rafah, it's just looking very, very dire, like in the most like strictest sense of the word. And I would say everything taking place in Russia at the moment with the peace talk we've been discussing, that's essentially gone underwater at this point because of the Crocus City Hall attack. things are very, very much on the brink of essentially total war from a series of countries all sort of taking place at once. And this is not just our analysis. I would say the American version of Yevgeny Prigozhin, of course, Eric Prince recently announced that Israel is essentially acting irrationally, striking at multiple targets at once, putting itself in danger. And Eric Prince, I mean, he's pro-American, so to speak, but he's also not exactly anti-Israel. And he's saying that Israel is really taking a bite that it really cannot chew and sort of devour and swallow. So Israel's like this beast, just hungry for more blood, I would say. No pun intended there. But let's just consider Netanyahu's actions in Rafah sort of before we move on. We did expect Netanyahu and the IDF to move into Rafah with tanks and maybe troops on the ground this week, but it's been actually held back, and we're quite we're happy about that, because the longer it's held off, the more people, I suppose, get saved, and the more perhaps the world can pressure Israel to actually stop this impending, essentially continued genocide that will take place there. What we need to consider is Netanyahu's recently announced a new strategy. He's saying that, yes, Rafah is actually infested with Hamas workers, Hezbollah-sided Palestinians, and essentially the only way to really take it is to secure that southern border of Rafah, of, essentially where Palestine and Israel meet, Egypt, and to make sure it's like a jar, so they cannot head south, they cannot escape into the Sinai Peninsula, and then of course Israel can go in and find amongst these 1.5 to 2 million Palestinians, have an audit, and audit at at the end of the barrel of a gun, and essentially find all of the Hamas operatives in this bag, and just search amongst them and see who's a so-called terrorist and who's not. I mean, this is insane, of course, and it definitely won't work. There'll be a lot of innocents killed. But this is Netanyahu's recent answer to Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, essentially telling him to slow down, which, again, it's not really feasible. And I guess any day now, and it is the end of Ramadan, so perhaps they were waiting for this sort of Islamic feast to sort of end, this time of fasting and this time of spiritual solemnity to sort of go by, so that, of course, the Muslim world will not react so abrasively to what's about to take place in southern Gaza. I guess that's the timing right now, because we do see a lot of Muslims praying in Jerusalem, a lot of pilgrimage happening in just west of the Jordan. So again, it's a real time for contemplation for the Islamic world. And yeah, as you see with the United Arab Emirates, I think people are suddenly waking up in some of these Sunni countries, and they're realizing that sooner rather than later, they're going to have to make a choice on a state level. Like the common people, the people online have already chosen the Palestinians as their heroes, as their sort of victims of Zionist oppression. It's just the states and the people in power actually need to choose whether they want their blood money and their oil money, or whether they're actually supportive of their, I guess, what you'd call Islamic solidarity and the solidarity of the poor people of Palestine, which at the moment are at risk of completely disappearing off the face of the earth.
The destruction of Palestine is nearing totality. I mean, I remember weeks and weeks ago we talked about, what was it, 60% of the buildings or something had been leveled, some of these crazy numbers. So they really are flattening it. And we hear rumors of Jared Kushner wanting to develop, oceanfront property in Gaza. And of course, we know about the resources off the coast of Gaza and all of these absurd Jewish things that we hear that these people are trying to do to these people that they had already subjected to, an open air prison for decades and decades. But the escalations against Israel have also been somewhat effective. We see the Houthis being offered, removal from the terrorist list, the international, terrorism registry and whatnot, that basically gives the US and the West the right to bomb and assault groups that they deem terrorists. Not that there aren't legitimate terrorists on that list, ISIS and other groups that ironically the West helped foment. But the Houthis, they're basically being told, please stop with your blockade of the Red Sea, with, your bombing of the ships passing through the Bab el-Mandeb Straits, and we will stop calling you terrorists, and maybe even we can move forward with, internationally recognizing, the Ansar Allah government, the current operating forces that are in, the capital and, actually ruling Yemen effectively on the ground right now. Very interesting. I actually wouldn't be surprised if the Houthis are just like, nah, and just keep shooting, because they really are in this for Palestine. Like, they don't really care about international recognition. They were doing fine up until this point. What they want is Israel to stop genociding people in Gaza, and that is not what appears to be happening. The U.S. seems willing to let Israel do whatever it wants in Rafah and in Gaza, and sure, they may let Israel reap the fruits of those consequences without helping as much as, the Jews want them to, but it's still going to happen anyway. And that's what they said. They said the genocide in Gaza has to stop, or we're going to keep hitting ships. And, I support them in that conviction. They're standing by their principles, unlike most other groups. And I guess if Rafah really falls, we'll see if Hezbollah is going to stick to its word. Nasrallah has been saying that the next Iranian strikes are going to be, a next stage. He seems to imply that there is a escalation. He seems to imply that perhaps behind the scenes, Iran is giving the go-ahead. We have seen more attacks on Israel itself and into the Golan Heights from, the Islamic resistance in Iraq and Syria, which have now obviously unified. All the Shia groups have been unified basically since October 7th against Israel. So we may be seeing a lot of escalations there. But again, it doesn't matter how much the U.S. says they're going to leave Israel to their own devices. I think when the rubber hits the road, the U.S. is probably going to get roped in. But again, there is evidence that that may not be exactly how it goes down. St. Paisios talks about the Israelis really moving on the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque and these things that are on the Temple Mount, and that it'll be destroyed, and then that will result in Israel's destruction. And ironically, Lucas Gage, he said that that would likely be something that would occur. That I asked him what he thinks would really do it, would cause Iran to go all in. And he thinks that the whole Muslim world ultimately would do something if Israel moves on the Dome of the Rock and all of these things and some of their eschatological goals. And we are seeing the Temple Institute talk about all these things. We're going to talk about that in a little bit later on the show. But I agree with him in that regard. And, the 80-year lifespan of Israel and the Jewish states that we've talked about, of course, that coincides with some things St. Paisios said about, 75, 80 years, and Israel will face some kind of systematic change or destruction or whatever it is. And we're much closer to that than anyone would have thought just 6, 7, 8 months ago. So very, very interesting times, to say the least. Dimitri, I don't know if you have anything else to say about, some of the Gulf states and Israel. Obviously, we said the UAE, they have finally stopped diplomatic correlation with Israel. They were, of course, the biggest Zog slaves of all of these Muslim countries. And they've decided finally enough is enough. They're striking consulates. They're killing aid workers from all over the West. This is absurd. So Israel is really turning itself into a bit of a pariah. But that Jewish power, they make up for it, with all of their, with what they've done with getting the golem that is the U.S. and these other places. So really only Israel could be pulling this off right now. But unless you have anything else to say about that, we could probably talk about the Armenia-Azerbaijan stuff, because there seems to be some looming possible invasions there as well.
Yeah, I think the commonality between Armenia, Azerbaijan, all of these conflicts, and even I would say the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, is that sort of ideal of, I guess you can say, almost I'm not sure if the Semitic people have it, but Indo-Europeans certainly have this very distinct cultural idea of honor and, self-respect. And when somebody insults your honor, of course, they need to, retaliate. It's this idea of revenge, an eye for an eye, which, of course, in the New Testament is kind of looked down upon. You're supposed to forgive your neighbor and not really seek vengeance against them. But here we have, if you strike me, I'll strike you back, and so forth and so on. And that escalates, of course, past diplomacy into warfare. And Israel, of course, lives by that sort of ideal and naturally forces all of its neighbors through its actions to sort of seek out revenge as well against them. Because, again, indiscriminate bombing of Syria, blaming the Houthis, calling them essentially Iranian proxies. You can see that sort of signaling all over CNN, even Fox News, constant signaling that the Houthis are Iranian proxies, painting Iran as the next enemy. This has been going on since I would say even Obama administration, even though Obama's was pretty friendly towards Iran. But nevertheless, as soon as Donald Trump came in, somehow the Trump administration, probably not Trump himself, but those around him kind of forced his hand and painted Iran as this primary enemy of the United States in the Middle East. And this going forward, this prior signaling, essentially, this is like a secular version of clairvoyance, this prophesizing of the future, saying, well, if we're going to project that Iran is the enemy, eventually they will in fact become the enemy. It's this weird sorcery that's happening here in international relations. You guys have probably seen it before with Iraq prior to, Operation Desert Storm, and of course, 2003 taking place after 9/11. It's just a really clear signaling we've been seeing about Iran, and it's not surprising that eventually I think Iran will in fact step into this third world war. It will be a major player, and unfortunately for the Iranian Persian people who've already suffered enough of like weird revolutions and all kinds of things in the last 100 years, they're going to be challenged once more by this sort of great struggle taking place. Yeah, just like Syria, like Assad Syria, I would say многострадальная, long-suffering Syria will probably still be an element in this great puzzle of the world warfare that will definitely take place quite soon, unfortunately. And just all these major players are taking it into account. Notice how even when the Prigozhin thing happened in Russia, certain elements within the Russian government simply couldn't forgive Colonel Dmitry Utkin and Prigozhin for what they did. And Azerbaijan, Armenia is the same. We see these border conflicts at the moment, shootouts happening on the Armenian-Azerbaijani border. One side cannot forgive the other for simply seceding for two prior minor wars that took place in the last few years. And even the guards themselves, this is down to the individuals, down to these little squads which meet up on the border and they see each other through their sort of, their ACOG scopes and things like that. And they just start shooting. And naturally, guards end up dying on either sides. These border shootouts have been happening for, I would say, the last 5 to 6 months. There's been at least like 10 casualties per side. And this eventually will escalate into another, I would say, the third Armenian Azerbaijani conflict in recent years. So it's just a never-ending sort of a wheel. But just like Trotsky called it the wheel of the revolution, this is not really that sort of Talmudic wheel. This is like the wheel of blood and vengeance, which will keep rolling. And of course, the Armenians also want revangism. They also want to come back and restore the honor of their country. So as you can see, I would say the devil, the sort of the main murderer of history, wants to move this sort of issue forward and see how people will react and if they'll take the bait. And unfortunately, there's no one really telling these countries to kind of hold back and perhaps seek peace or seek some sort of diplomatic solution. So Armenia and Azerbaijan is heating up, and Pashinyan is just this jester, this is Zelensky type figure who may actually push these two countries further into war. And I'm not saying Aliyev is any better as well. We've spoken about Aliyev, the Mountain Jew, with his like oligarchic KGB-esque family. He's literally like, he has the liberal Jewish element of like the oligarchy built into old KGB hierarchy of the Trans-Caucasus region, which, I mean, it's like the worst of both worlds. Essentially, you have Bolshevism and you have liberal Jewish capitalism combined. So just your thoughts on that, Conrad, because again, as soon as Armenia, Azerbaijan take place, this conflict, right, we're going to see Christians getting hurt and we're going to see footage not of Ukrainian churches getting bombed by Ukrainian terrorists. We're going to see, again, Islamic desecration of Christian sites in Armenia, which, again, will really affect, I think, a lot of people negatively and mentally as well, because, again, whenever Christian persecution takes place, it just hits a little bit harder because it's just the sites we really aren't used to in the 21st century.
Well, you mentioned Iran and them getting dragged into all of this. This is relatively recent. Amid rising tensions between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Islamic Republic has for the first time started arming Armenia. This is from Middle East Spectator. Today, an Iranian military-affiliated Boeing 747 took off from Tehran towards Armenia, turning off its GPS as it entered Armenian airspace. Various outlets claim the cargo consisted of drones and other weapon systems. Iran has repeatedly clarified its position that it will not allow any change in the regional borders, especially not the creation of the so-called Zangezur corridor in Armenia's Syunik region. And of course, the Zangezur corridor would connect federal mainland Azerbaijan with the Nakhchivan exclave, which is just separated from the rest of Azerbaijan by that sliver of the Armenian panhandle in the south. So Azerbaijan wants to fully connect, have that entire highway in that region connected with their exclave, which connects to Turkey, so it would complete roadway without any interference from a Christian or non-Turkic state from Baku, all the way to Istanbul and ultimately to Europe. So that is what Azerbaijan is trying to achieve. Armenia was also supposed to give up 4 towns that were in exclaves in northern Armenia in the Tavish region, and they apparently refused to do that. I think Pashinyan basically tried to get them to do it, and the locals said, no, you basically have no authority here, and he went with that. Of course, Pashinyan is completely flirting with the French and the West and NATO and Turkey. They basically said that they don't care if Armenia joins NATO or anything like that. They are going to do what they need to do regardless. Turkish sources are saying that they're just going to invade anyway, that it literally doesn't matter. Again, this is also talking about a Turkish invasion, not just an Azeri invasion, because the Azeris have basically already moved in on the border. They're ready to do their stuff, but the Turks have also said that they may end up helping Azerbaijan from the west. So it's really not looking good for Armenia. Italy has come out against France's support for Armenia, so they're the first to kind of claim that they are not in favor of this unconditional support from the West for Armenia against Azerbaijan. Of course, Russia has basically stayed neutral, which is a bit unfortunate. I think the Azeris are not actually the best friends to have, especially how we know the Turkish situation is going to go, because recently these big Turkish elections happened, and for the first time in decades, really, Erdogan's party lost. The Kemalist, more secular party, they won. The mayor of Istanbul is still the Kemalist. I believe the mayor of Ankara. All these regions are now under the control of, I believe the CHP is the secular party. And this just fulfills, the prophecies again about that eventually Kemalists will be the full ones in power. And they will not stop this, militarization that Erdogan has been doing. They will be doing that as well as, shifting their focus from being against, for example, Israel or any other place to being against Russia, and of course still being against Armenia and still being against Greece. So that's how that's going to go from that perspective. Erdogan has already said he's not going to run for re-election in 2028. This new party has now taken power away from Erdogan's party as far as the majority of these mayorships and other things in the parliament and whatnot go. So it appears that political Islam is on its way out in Turkey, and the Kemalists will, by 2028, be fully in power. And I posted about this on X. This will really be the beginning of the political process that will set Turkey on its collision course with Russia. And this Azerbaijan-Armenia thing is going to be a pretext to that. If Turkey is able to completely solidify Russia's entire southern flank and basically render Armenia no longer even in the CSTO, it's kind of a strategy. They're getting Armenia to completely leave Russia's sphere of influence because Russia isn't helping them, getting them out of the CSTO, all of these things to try to get help from the West. The Kemalists are going to come in power anyway, so the entire thing will be this Turkic Western-backed, basically, control axis that Russia's going to have to deal with when they inevitably, I believe, fight against Turkey. And this leads into Cyprus and the other prophecies that we always talk about with World War III and Greece and the Greek saints and Metropolitan Neophytos, because this is breaking as well. The Azeris have basically opened a collaborative parliamentary group with Northern Cyprus. And Northern Cyprus, or people call it the Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, it's the northern third of Cyprus occupied by Turkey. And it's only recognized by Turkey. Internationally, it's recognized as part of, Greek Cyprus or just the Republic of Cyprus. And as of now, it seems that Azerbaijan is moving forward with recognizing Northern Cyprus, becoming the first nation to do so. And that's probably to help get support for Turkey. Maybe that's what they need to do to get Turkey to invade Armenia from the west. But it's interesting as well, though, this probably does come with tacit Israeli support, because Israel and Azerbaijan, only Turkey and Azerbaijan are closer than Israel and Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan is giving Israel so much of its energy and natural gas and oil and some of these other things that they need, from the Caspian Sea. Turkey, of course, while being very rhetorically aggressive against Israel and giving a lot of aid to Gaza, ultimately, many have said that it's really just hot air, that Turkey has no intention of actually going the distance like perhaps Iran and, of course, the axis of resistance. And, even some of these other countries that are also being paid off, Egypt and Jordan have to be paid off in these ways to not go against Israel. Turkey doesn't really have to be paid off in that same way. So it's interesting to see where everybody is aligning here. But yeah, Northern Cyprus, if it gets recognized by Azerbaijan, that would be a big deal in the world of, World War now, of course. And with Israel being involved, it's all quite interesting. So Dimitri, I'm wondering, what are your thoughts on the current situation in Turkey? They did leave the same arms treaty that Poland and Moldova and these other countries have left. So again, it's all falling into place for this big escalation with Russia, on a more long time frame. But, Turkey militarizing, of course, that has to do with the Kurdish situation as well. It really does seem all to be moving in the World War now direction.
No, absolutely. I think what's interesting is Turkey's anti-air missile deal that it had with Russia essentially went under, and of course the Patriot missile system deal with the US. Also, the US kind of said that it won't be selling anything to Turkey. It's sort of the second largest army in NATO. So Turkey, in fact, is developing its own weapons, developing its own fifth generation aircraft fighters. It's essentially building itself up to be this major player in the Turkic world. And, a friend of mine who's an economist, we were kind of speaking about these various coalitions taking place. And it goes a little bit beyond just simply talking about the Silk Road and China's ambitions or the Eurasianist project. I think what we're looking at here is potentially this return to a sort of ethno-national union. So we have Northern Cyprus, the greater, of course, Turkey, or what I guess we'll see as Greater Turkey, or this Neo-Ottoman project, this alignment with Azerbaijan. The Turkic people are again uniting, and across the Caspian Sea, of course, Turkey is looking towards these free neighbors, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kazakhstan, to sort of join it in this massive union, and taking, of course, these Central Asian major countries with immense resources. Uzbekistan is the, I believe, second largest holder of uranium in the world, which could essentially make Turkey a nuclear superpower in the future. So these sort of alignments, and of course, as we know, Uzbekistan, like from sort of inside sources, has made deals with the Rothschilds family in the 1990s when the USSR broke away. So we have these sort of ties connecting sort of I guess Jewish money to this Turkic world project. But again, the Turkish people, they do have the sort of prior cultural, going back 1,000 years, they have this, I guess, connection to a sort of one origin point in Central Asia, and perhaps they're trying to unite on that basis. And you can say it's semi-Islamic, but perhaps this future project is kind of their alternative to whatever we see building between, say, India, Saudi Arabia, the Mumbai Dubai project, where I guess that trade pipeline goes through Israel to Greece and funnels goods from India all the way to the EU, kind of bypassing Turkey, but instead benefiting Greece, of course. We kind of see alternatives building on the Turkish end, and I guess this is the big project. And Russia really, as you said, Russia needs to be wary of this, because if this Turkish project completes itself, and you have countries like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan joining Azerbaijan and Turkey, this major southern heartland belt completing itself. When this heartland belt completes itself, it's going to be very difficult for Russia to, I guess, spread even not just its influence, but also attempt to kind of retake potentially former territory down south. And in fact, who knows what kind of impacts this new Turkish superpower will have, I guess, on world affairs. Essentially, they're not really going to be under the influence of China, nor Persia, nor even the Western world, and it'll be an entirely new actor that Russia will have to contend itself again. Essentially, this new sort of southern Asiatic type horde. And I'm not saying this in like a bad way, but it's like the new empire of Tamerlan or something like that, or a new Ottoman Empire in the south. And again, this completely aligns with the prophecies which say that Turkey will be a major player in the future, but perhaps we'll see these Central Asian countries also kind of being part of that particular picture. And again, countries like Georgia will be completely isolated. Armenia, these minor like NATO, EU adjacent countries will be, nevertheless, they are Christian, and in Georgia is an Eastern Orthodox Christian country, but they will be completely isolated and devoured either culturally or even geopolitically if they don't choose a side very quickly. So Russia needs to sort out the Ukrainian Moldovan situation, right? And of course, move its attention down south, because there's a lot of movements happening in Asia. We see, of course, Kazakhstan, the major player, Conrad, which we spoke about for ages. But Kazakhstan is at the moment really trying to move itself away from the Russian sphere of influence economically, and kind of align itself a little bit more with China, a bit more of its sort of Turkic neighbors down south. And perhaps in the future we'll see some sort of Kazakh-Turkish alliance as well, which will kind of thwart any sort of Russian interests. Because again, Kazakhstan is that the majority of Kazakhstan, in fact, is classical Russian land, which once belonged to the Cossack hosts. And, the Russians actually built up Kazakhstan, which was essentially a nomadic field, like just a steppe, which, of course, the nomadic people never built any cities. And it was essentially what you could refer to as just no man's land, where they just traveled and the horses ate grass and they had, cattle and livestock and things like that. But it just brings around this new geopolitical axis and sort of touch point that we have to look at. And it just seems like everything is falling into the right direction, and Azerbaijan is playing everything correctly. Azerbaijan is playing 5D, 6D chess here at the moment. Their influence and their lobby in Moscow is just really curious to see. They're painting Armenia as the unreasonable Ukrainian-sided globalists, while themselves actually colluding actively with straight-up Zionists, capitalists, and even the Crocus City Hall kind of example brings this up, where it's literally Azeri Hasidic Jews involved in the whole Crocus City Hall project, but they're not, of course, painted as villains or even suspects in this at all. And that's despite the Crocus City Hall accident being incredibly suspicious, terrorist act and things like that. But still, Azerbaijan just gets away with everything, and perhaps we'll even start a third war that we'll see very shortly. So it's looking mighty curious, and it'll be good to see if Armenia can adequately react with all the French aid that it's received in the last few months.
Yeah, I wonder if Azerbaijan goes forward with recognizing Northern Cyprus, if anybody will follow at all. I'm not sure. I don't know how much pull Turkey has outside of Azerbaijan in that specific regard. Of course, Turkey is also trying to push into Syria, even have a corridor and a DMZ into Iraq. So they really are moving forward with this ambitious neo-Ottoman goal, which again, my perspective on a longer timeline is that it will be used to, not by Erdogan itself, but later by, a more pro-Western, anti-Russian force, these geographic gains by Erdogan and by this militant Islamic outlook will then be used against Russia. And I think Georgia, on the long enough timeline, hopefully they will side again with the Russian world against the impending, secular/Turkic and Islamic belt that is surrounding them. But it's all very interesting. Of course, the prophecies say that the Turks will actually withdraw from northern Cyprus, at least militarily speaking, and that will leave a vacuum where the church will need to, forgive and actually evangelize these Turks that have immigrated there and those that have turned this Greek Orthodox land into an unfortunate Muslim holdout. So we have to pray for all of that. Of course, Metropolitan Neophytos, the city of Morphu itself, is in northern Cyprus. He is on the other side, sort of in exile, as it were, in the part of his metropolis and with his people that are on the Greek side of the border. But hopefully he can sit in the true, throne, and we can rebuild the churches in Morphu and everything, because that's the birthplace of Saint Philomenos, who, he passed away only a few years after the Turkish invasion of Cyprus. So perhaps we'll do an Ether Hour, fully going into the Turkish invasion and deconstructing all the sources and looking at some of the stories and miracles surrounding that. Let us know in the comments if you'd like to hear that. But I think we have to move on to the Balkans, Dimitri. There's some big news with Srpska and Serbia. Milorad Dodik, he has just gotten back from a trip to Hungary where he appears to have basically gotten the approval to secede from Bosnia from Orban. He says that if the economic, oppression of Srpska and, the diplomatic pressure and, these threats to arrest Dodik and all of these things, if that continues, then he will secede. And I guess in some capacity, he does have veto power in the European Union to stop certain actions that could be taken against Srpska, maybe giving Serbia the opening to give them the support that they need. Of course, Serbia and Hungary very close. They're building pipelines to each other's countries. The Hungarians view the Serbians as the people that treat the Hungarian minority in their country the best, especially compared to Ukraine these days. So Hungary, very pro-Russia, of course, recently, very pro-Serbia. So we like what Orban is doing. He's been, being more pro-Slavic as opposed to his more pro-Israel credentials, which he perhaps has been downplaying a little bit recently. So it's very interesting to see. But Dimitri, I'm wondering, what do you think? Is this really the end of Bosnia and Herzegovina? Is the dream dying for, Gunther Fellinger heads?
I think it's dying, but also it's not dying with like a squeal. They're actually fighting for it. Not just the planes that we mentioned a couple of weeks ago flying over Republika Srpska, but also the pressure that's put on Vucic and any allies attached to Dodik. Even I would say Orban himself, like Orban announcing that potential Dodik secession from Bosnia-Herzegovina, like the official state, would take place and that he would, of course, side of it, has been met with a colored, essentially, what I would call an attempt at a colored revolution in Hungary itself, where you have thousands of people actually protesting on the streets. And the protests are being led by a guy of a really suspicious name. Like, it's almost made up. It's literally Peter Magyar, like a Hungarian lawyer, and you'd think like his name, it's like, honestly, if his name was Peter the Hungarian, it would be almost like a medieval sort of title, right? But here we have Peter Magyar sort of leading the protest. He's like a lawyer and like a oppositional activist, like essentially like a Navalny type figure in Hungary. And of course, as we can imagine, these sort of colored revolution protests, and they're protesting pro-Ukraine, they're pro-Israel, they're anti-Orban. Orban's a dictator, things like that. Even though Orban was winning every single election fair and square up until this point, completely in line with EU standards, very sort of liberal, very democratic. But still, they're not happy about Hungary blocking these Ukrainian goods. They're not happy about Orban, of course, having the interview with Tucker Carlson. They're not happy about him meeting Dodik. Orban's looking a bit like a Lukashenko of Eastern Europe. And I guess Hungary, of course, I mean, come on, Hungary had its issues with the Soviet Eastern Bloc. It's not really going to fall under sort of Russian, I would say, it's not going to sort of lay down and sort of let Russia step all over it. But of course, Hungary has its own personal national interest, which it's a really proud country. It's a very unique culture, and its people have, they're quite a powerful sort of force to be reckoned with. They participated in World War II quite actively. Like, everybody sort of appreciates Hungarian participation in the Third Reich. We remember Hungarians in the First World War. These are a powerful sort of people, despite the population being under 10 million at this point. So it's just very interesting that Dodik seems to align himself with like one of this more, I guess, Pasionarie, these more active people in Eastern Europe. And it's just, there are similarities, of course, between Dodik, Lukashenko, Orban, these powerful conservative type leaders who are just not looking to, of course, align themselves with gay, liberal, LGBT friendly, fake human rights-esque Europe. And it's really good seeing all of them agree at certain things. And of course, Dodik, what are the hopes? The hopes are, first and foremost, that he doesn't get assassinated by, I'm not sure, the CIA, or because essentially the way they're viewing Republika Srpska, and I would say the rising threat of maybe like a based Vucic, where he takes himself out of the sort of liberal image that he's, sort of the hole that he's dug himself into, is we're looking at a rearguard attack on this NATO beast that's been building up in Eastern Europe, all the funds being funneled into Ukraine. We're essentially looking at a pro-Russian coalition being built up essentially right almost in the center of Europe itself, which of course is immensely dangerous because, again, as soon as Russia reignites the sort of flame of orthodoxy, you'll have this very based orthodox sort of, I would say, not a Russian satellite state, but a friendly allied state of Russia arise in the center of Europe, which will not betray its Russian allies, especially if Russia really embraces Orthodox Christianity, which it really has been doing recently, and it's been kind of improving upon that with Putin's speeches. Putin's really kind of recognized Christianity as the main sort of value that will keep Russians together, and Patriarch Kirill's recent statements. I think it's all coming towards that, and so they'll be viewing Dodik as this major, I would say, major pro-Russian, pro-Putin, pro-Lukashenko threat, and I really fear for Dodik's life. I think at this point we should all, I suppose, keep him in our prayers, especially if he's a practicing Orthodox Christian. Or regardless, I mean, God's will be done. If Dodik is the person to reunite the sort of Serbia-Yugoslavian coalition that once existed in the past, so be it. But hopefully that is what will take place, because I guess the future of the Serbian people at the moment is not looking too good, especially with the encroachment of NATO and EU upon its culture and the sort of corruption of its, its sort of natural state over the last few years. This is happening to all European countries. They're all being corrupted slowly. It's the frog in the boiling pot analogy, I think, that applies to most of these countries in Europe.
Yeah, I think we're very much going to see a map change within our lifetimes, if not within the next 5 years, within the Balkan region. Of course, I think the situation with migration in Europe is going to the point where people would be willing to allow, I think, the Serbs to have more autonomy with that, as they need to deal with their own Muslim issues across the continent already. But of course, it all also comes back to the Russia situation, because if Russia is free and is sort of wrapped up and not as tied down in Ukraine, they will be able to assist the Serbs both diplomatically and possibly militarily. And right now, of course, we see the Russians advancing across the front line fairly consistently, not in any huge ways, but gaining a few kilometers here and there across multiple nodes, different villages, still advancing past Avdiivka, still advancing past Bakhmut, some of these places. And we're also seeing, some basically aggressive moves from Ukraine, ironically, on the Transnistria, Pridnestrovia front, because we're hearing about these strikes, on and near Transnistria. We're hearing about talk of more reunion between Moldova and Romania, talk about Moldova and even Ukraine's entrance into NATO and all of these sorts of things. The West, of course, France, undercover sending troops to Ukraine, overtly sending troops to Romania. We hear that Gagauzia, the Turkic Orthodox region of Moldova, will secede if Romania reunites with Moldova. They had already talked about cooperation with Russia. The president of Gagauzia recently was in Russia. There was rumors about her getting arrested. We talked about that a few episodes ago. So the situation in Ukraine, obviously, well, not as dramatic right now, ironically, as other parts of the world. Something big is in the works. The Russian advance, the big Russian offensive, I think, is weeks, if not 1 or 2 months away. So we're going to be seeing some pretty dramatic changes there. And despite all of the saber rattling from Macron, it may have just been that, to try to deter the Russians. And once the Russians do what they have to do, the paper tiger of these Western armies may ultimately fall away. And we know that the U.S., while unfortunately Speaker Mike Johnson is talking about really prioritizing Ukraine aid for some reason, despite standing strong on it before, that may change some things. But it is still hard in the U.S. to get that through. So if it doesn't come through soon, this Russian offensive may be what does it. And I don't know if the U.S. even wants to back a loser. They want to maybe make it more overt that they were distancing themselves from Ukraine and Ukraine needs to lose and all these sorts of things. Of course, we are waiting for that May 20th, deadline where Zelensky will, I guess, be illegitimate in the eyes of the Russians and the world, as he has postponed elections. So all very interesting things, of course. We've got to talk about some of these more esoteric issues as well, with the eclipse and the red heifers, of course. Previous World War Now, we talked about the ritual that was the Crocus attack, so I think there should be a clip on WWN Clips, World War Now Clips, coming out about that, so be sure to share that around when you see it. But Dimitri, any thoughts on the situation in Ukraine and Moldova, Pridnestrovia, before we talk about some of these more esoteric issues and then move to some other miscellaneous World War III nodes around the world?
Yeah, I would say just real quick, Moldova is really kind of painting itself as this enemy of not just the Russian Federation and I guess what they call the regime of Putin, but the Russian history and the Russian Empire in general. Because at Chisinau, court, actually, at the request of the General Prosecutor's Office of Moldova and the Ministry of Justice, has officially announced that the Russian black, yellow, white flag, which is the Russian Tsar imperial flag, which, again, it was the official Russian flag between 1858 and 1896, but officially in Russia, of course, the classical flag we see today was always used as the international flag of, Russian recognition. It was flown on all the ships, on all the military as well as civilian ships as well. But still, this black, yellow, white flag, it's kind of associated with the Russian Empire, of the Tsars, and Moldovan court in 30 days' time, if the decision isn't appealed, this monarchist flag, essentially the flag of the Tsars, will be banned on the territory of Moldova, which is very, very curious that they're striking out against essentially Russian history and against what they deem as Russian extremist nationalist symbolism. Again, extremely zogged out decision, but what else can we expect from Moldova, which is inviting over, Romanian jurisdiction, causing ecclesiastical schisms and causing a lot of issues on Moldovan territory from the church's perspective, but now even politically attempting to align itself with the more EU, NATO sided sort of spectrum of the European conflict at the moment. It's just very unfortunate that this once
It's extreme anti-Pridnestrovian discrimination. We know Vadim Krasnoselsky, they consider themselves part of the Russian Empire.
Mhm.
Look past all the Soviet symbolism. That's the last holdout of the Russian Empire. So this is extreme anti-Orthodox, anti-imperial action, and it must be stopped immediately. Sorry to interrupt.
No, 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 completely correct. And I would also say that, we try to say Pridnestrovia, but for some speakers, it may be a little bit hard to pronounce. So even for some listeners, they may say, "Wait, Pridnestrovia, what is that? How do I spell that? How do I Google it?" So Transnistria is the English speaking, but Vadim Krasnoselsky has stated that Transnistria equals like a holocaust of Pridnestrovians and Russian people. So the president of Pridnestrovia, has actually announced that Transnistria is, just as bad as the word trans itself, and it's just not to be spoken in his sort of state. So, with all due respect, we'll be trying to call it Pridnestrovia from here on in, and I think all of our viewers and listeners should try that as well. Again, it's a difficult exercise in the English language because Transnistria is just so much easier to pronounce, but here we are. Nevertheless, again, the last holdout of the Russian Empire on the map of Europe will soon, I guess, realign or perhaps even set the main Russian Federation straight on exactly how politics should be conducted. Very strong orthodox politics going on over there. And just sad that Moldova is getting involved. The other, of course, news that you mentioned was a Transnistrian, military announcement has been made that a Ukrainian drone crossed the border into Transnistria in the south, just south of the capital, and actually dropped a bomb on a radar station. So, the first strike of a Ukrainian military, I guess you could say, military robot on Transnistrian. No one was hurt, but again, bringing Transnistria into the conflict, as we know, will essentially automatically bring in the Operation Odessa, Operation possibly occupy Moldova temporarily by the Russian forces, and the SMO will be moved into overdrive because if Transnistria and Pridnestrovia, if it falls to Ukraine, or that this combination of Ukraine and of course Moldovan joint pincer action, Russia will be greatly disadvantaged. So we'll be looking for, kind of tracking that particular news, seeing where it's going, but no casualties at the moment on that front. So that's quite positive, I would say.
Yeah, we're still watching Odessa. We're watching the Black Sea situation. Of course, the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits that had been briefly in the news as some of the things heated up around there. So always on watch there. Crimea has been facing less strikes perhaps than recently. We did see some Ukrainian strikes actually up into the Kursk region again and some of these other places. So always going to be watching all of that. I think in the next few weeks we're going to see more and more advances and more collapse, frankly, from the Ukrainians across the front lines. So keep praying. Of course, the Ukrainians are also striking churches explicitly within Russia. So that continues. We're going to talk about some church persecution stuff in a minute. But while we are still here in the middle of the show, before we get to the last third, I guess we want to talk about the upcoming eclipse. Of course, David Patrick Harry, Church of the Eternal Logos, he had a pretty good stream kind of going through all of the discourse about this. A lot of Protestants predicting that Jesus is imminently coming. A lot of other people talking about how this will be an energy harvesting ritual. Of course, personally, there's something up. Of course, I live in Austin, Texas. It's where absolute totality will be. I'll actually be even just a little bit west in the morning before the eclipse really starts, exactly where the totality is going to be for the longest period of time. and a lot of interesting things are happening. I mean, of course, CERN is operating for the first time in 2 years. They're firing it up to try to, I guess, test for dark matter, which of course dark matter doesn't exist, but they claim it's to learn new things about the universe during the energy, I guess, being released from the eclipse. So this is like real science stuff, of course. When I speak about energy, I speak about it as well in the symbolic, ethereal sense, with sigils and in a more magical realm, I guess. But the scientists are talking about this. NASA is also launching 3 rockets at the dark side of the moon for some reason as this goes on. So a lot of very weird stuff from the satanic echelons of our scientific society. But also in my hometown, my favorite band, Vampire Weekend, frontman Ezra Koenig, who, famous Yid, they're performing their new album, Only God Was Above Us, and I've been listening to it. It just released the day before we're recording this. Great album. I recommend everybody listen to it. But, some of the lyrics in there are pretty esoteric. They've always been a bit that way. They've always had very interesting lyrics in their music. And the concert will be performed, as the eclipse is going on under this amphitheater with the open ceiling where you can see the eclipse and all of these sorts of things. And we're going to talk about some of these details with the red heifers and the Levite priests and all of these sorts of things. And they talk about how some of the last time this occurred was in the time of Ezra, in the Old Testament and these sorts of things. And this guy, Ezra Koenig, the lead singer of this band, Vampire Weekend, years ago, he said that he's the most relevant Ezra of our time. It was a very weird thing to say. And his music is full of some of these very esoteric Jewish things. Their previous album talks about Christians, in the lion's pit, being fed to lions. Literally, one of the lyrics in the song is Judeo-Christianity. I never heard the word from a Jew saying that Judeo-Christian is like a nonsensical idea. And on the first track on their new album, of course, they talk all about, one of the lyrics is about Serbians, Kosovar Albanians, Romanians, Transylvanians, and how they're all the sons of vampires that sucked the old world's neck. These are lyrics from the latest album, first track, on the new album. And there's songs called Pravda. There's all these very interesting things. Very good album. I really like the music, so check that out. But in my opinion, it ties a little bit too conveniently in with some of this other symbolic stuff happening with this big eclipse that everybody's getting all apocalyptic about. And look, eclipses do occur in the Bible. There are signs. St. Paul does say that Christians will be able to assess the sign of the times, but at the same time, St. Gabriel or Gabadzi, he said that in the times of the end, the latter days, that very dangerous deceptions will come from the sky. So I've posited that St. Gabriel, if he were around today, he might not even look up at the eclipse. He said that Christians in these last days should rarely even look up at the skies. So that's one perspective. But as far as this temple stuff with the red heifers, Cassie Dillon, of all people, the original Nick Fuentes hater, she took a picture with the red heifers in Shiloh in Israel, talking about it, trying to own the anti-Semites. And everybody's talking about how this doesn't matter. Even people on our side are like, this is a stupid distraction. The Jews are always talking about this. The evangelicals are always obsessed with it. And look, we understand that. We're not saying that this is all a bunch of evangelical kind of end time stuff. We're just objectively looking at what these powerful Jewish institutions are doing. The Temple Institute, directly connected with Benjamin Netanyahu, directly connected with very powerful people in Israel and around the world, they're posting all of this stuff. This is very recently. They posted a picture of some teenage Jewish guy in front of the red heifers. The post says, "A Cohen fit to perform the red heifer ceremony." The young Cohen in the photo visiting the red heifer candidate in Shiloh is fit to perform the red heifer ceremony. He came into the world via home birth, has never set foot in a hospital or cemetery, and therefore considered by halakha, Jewish law, to be of the highest level of Torah purity, having never contracted tumat met, which is impurity imparted by contact with a corpse. Should he opt to participate in the Temple Institute's ongoing preparations in anticipation of the renewal of the ashes of the red heifer, he will undergo intense instruction and training. And then it's just the ultimate Shlomo. Just look at this guy. Maybe we'll link the post. Standing in front of these red heifers. And you can also just go to the Temple Institute website, and they talk all about Numbers 19:2, which is the verse that talks about the red heifers in the Old Testament. But again, that's in the context of when the temple existed. The red heifers were supposed to be sacrificed in the context of temple worship. And this whole attempt they're doing right now, they have all this Talmudic nonsense. They say, well, this isn't talked about in the Torah, but it is in the Moshe oral tradition. They talk about all of this stuff about how it's not technically a sacrifice, but it will be used to create new ashes so that they can enter the Temple Mount. Because technically the Jews haven't been ritually purified to properly enter the Temple Mount. That's why they have to do all those rituals before, they storm Al-Aqsa and before they go and harass the Muslims there or anybody else that's there. So they're trying to get this specific priest, even if they're, a teenager, to get them into this program so they can be the purified sacrificer, basically, even though they claim it's not a sacrifice. It is a sacrifice. They kill and burn the cow, and then they have the ashes, and they can put it on the Jews, and then they can do it. And we talked about this with Lucas Gage. If they really go through with this in the next few years, the next few months, whenever it is, some say they may be doing something on the eclipse. There's talk about this diamond knife and all this stuff. They may even need to do it on an eclipse. There's all sorts of different Jews, I think, that talk about certain different things about it. But they put the ashes on these people, and then all the Jews mobilize on the temple and do something. Maybe they even destroy the Dome of the Rock, or they destroy Al-Aqsa or something like this. I mean, this would trigger a massive, like we said before, reaction from the Islamic world. So, Dimitri, I'm wondering your thoughts on all of these rituals. We've kind of been talking a lot about these rituals, these esoteric things on the show more recently. It wasn't always the focus. I think things are kind of being revealed as they were.
Well, it's really weird because we want things to be simple and kind of understandable, at least for our modern brains, because again, we're all people of the 21st century, you could say, or at least, some of us were born in the 20th century, so we're still like old heads, but we do want things to be somewhat secular. We're not used to this sort of mystical invading our modern world. We're not used to these sorcerers, rabbis, tzaddiks, and all these, like, essentially these evil wise men essentially kind of becoming involved in our everyday lives. I think most of us are happy just having a spiritual father, but suddenly there are these like weird people predicting the future and running governments and before our very eyes, and it's like, hold up, it's not very comfortable. But this is essentially how the world was, and how the world was for centuries now. Most countries were, of course, run by these weird sorcerers, warlocks, witches, and these people. You can see in different cultures, the eclipse actually, the eclipse in the Aztec religion meant a certain thing. And there is even all these websites at the moment, they're all predicting what the meaning that the eclipse has for various pagan cultures, and the Hindus waiting for a certain sign, and of course, the South Korean pagans and all these, even the Shintos in Japan are essentially waiting for a certain event to take place. I mean, there is all these people are waiting for signs out of the sky, and just, I guess, remembering the scriptures and what took place in world history prior, we just have to recall that when our Lord and Savior Christ, he gave up his soul on the cross, there was a major eclipse over Jerusalem and over the Holy Land, I guess over the whole world. And of course, that's a reaction. The sun itself sort of covered its face at the sign that the Savior himself passed on into Hades. It was just this tragic cosmic sort of event, and we just have to consider that even, I guess, these people, they see this sign that the eclipse took place then when Christ died was also a sign to the Jews and those people who actually slew him at the in Jerusalem itself, because again, these people actually believe in these sort of celestial signs. And we recall the three wise men, the three kings, the Chaldeans, these magi who visited the infant Christ, of course, in his manger. They were following that particular Bethlehem star because, again, this is the science of the Chaldeans, these people who, the Chaldean people itself, even the word Chaldean translated, Chaldeans were known to be stargazers, sorcerers, these astrologists, astronomers, alchemists. Even the word Chaldean in a lot of Slavonic languages was translated eventually to sorcerer. Khaldun comes from the word Chaldei, Chaldean. And in a lot of languages, even I think in Greece, Chaldean ends up meaning something. And of course, these people were famous for interpreting stars and sort of stargazing. And naturally, as we know, the Jews were slaves of the Chaldeans and the Babylonians in the 580s, the 60, 70 or so years, once the first temple of Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BC by Nebuchadnezzar II. So we know the Jews were infected with this sort of, I guess, this idea. Prior to Christ, of course, incarnating, they were infected with these sort of pagan beliefs, which they carried back over. And of course, the second temple was built, but still this sort of pagan baggage was left over. And it probably carried on into today's age, I would say, despite all of the prophets trying to teach them otherwise, to give up all these pagan ideas that you need to look to the sky for signs. So saying that this eclipse would have no meaning on modern Talmudic Jews, I think, is the wrong idea. And I think one of the sort of evidences towards that is just, even in Russian history recently, like just a bit over 100 years ago when the royal family was killed, they were killed during a very specific time on the 17th of July, which falls on what you'd call the dog star days, which aligns with the star of Sirius. And, the word Sirius essentially aligns with canines and dogs. And of course, the royal family's dogs were also killed on the 17th and 18th of July in 1918. Sort of in part, to sort of follow along with this particular ritual, which we'll cover in our new article that's pretty much about to come out in a few days' time. So these people, they love aligning stars, celestials, sort of symbols alongside calendar dates as well to some of their rituals and things that take place. So let's not be surprised if this eclipse is followed along with some sort of, again, retaliatory bombardment of Iran, so-called retaliatory, or if we see any sort of provocations, because it would fall completely in the auspices and sort of within the scope of what these particular folks believe in, unfortunately. And we Orthodox Christians, even though we do see stars and sort of celestial symbols, they do have some sort of meaning in the scripture. We're told again by the saints not to sort of follow them and not to use them as guidance, I guess, moving forward. So that's probably just no matter how pretty it is, I would say don't sort of force any sort of spiritual significance onto it. Leave that in the hands of these new Chaldean Talmudic sorcerers and the tzaddiks and the rabbis, because again, this isn't Christianity sort of following these particular mystical signs. I think we have Christ to sort of lean against and Christ to focus on.
Yes, we of course have our upcoming series on John Vitatsis and the Marble King and the Sleeper Saint. So look forward to that. Get behind the paywall so that when it drops, you can immediately hear the whole thing, worldwarnow.co. That's where you can find all of that. But I think we'll start discussing some of these other stories that, we can get through a little bit more quickly. Of course, Ethiopia and Somalia are at odds once again. They have continued to recognize Ethiopia as is, continues to recognize Somaliland and is doing that, as well as the region of Puntland, which is part of Somalia, has I think a little bit part of itself in Somaliland. They have refused to kick out the Ethiopian consulates and embassies in their region, despite Mogadishu trying to completely sever ties because they are trying to stand, for their territorial sovereignty. They don't recognize Somaliland. So Ethiopia moving forward, it shows that they're committed to, having this port, getting this access to the Red Sea and the broader world. Again, huge country, well over 110 million people, and they have no access to the ocean. And of course, the issues with Eritrea are there, and they don't want to actually invade and go to war. So they're finding this compromise with Somaliland. And Somalia, unfortunately, they have the backing of the whole Arab world, even though they are effectively just a failed state. So that's going down. While at the same time, across the ocean on the South American continent, things are escalating very much in a World War III direction there as well. Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, he signed legislation into law de jure annexing the territory of Guyana Essequibo. So he's effectively on paper, saying this is ours. They had already printed all those maps around their embassies, but it seems that they're really moving forward with this. Of course, they want to gain this 2/3 territory of Guyana on the other side of the Essequibo, the west side of the Essequibo River, so that they can get access to the offshore resources that having that shoreline would gain you access to in your exclusive economic zone. And there's huge oil fields and natural gas reserves off the coast there that Venezuela wants to be able to exploit with its state monopolies and gain the funds to keep funding its command economy and collapsing state with hyperinflation and all of these sorts of things. Of course, Venezuela and Cuba and all of these more Chavist, former communist socialist states are still very much getting closer with Russia and Eurasia in the midst of all of this multipolarity stuff. So it very much has World War III implications. And of course, there was the big disputes with Hess and all of these companies that were trying to get access to this because Guyana, of course, close ally of the U.S. The president of Guyana has been, in his uniform on the border saying that they'll fight Venezuela, even though I'm pretty sure the Venezuelan military is almost the same size as the entire population of Guyana. We've made that point before, but we're watching that very closely. If Venezuela makes a move, that would be very interesting. In general, South America is very unstable, the most unstable it's been in decades. Of course, Malay is shaking things up. Brazil with Lula da Silva and Bolsonaro, being wanted, all these sorts of things. It's very unstable, and we're seeing that instability in this big dispute between Ecuador and Mexico. This is very recent, within, hours, basically, of us recording this. The Ecuadorian police special forces, they stormed the embassy of Mexico in Quito, the capital of Ecuador, and they arrested the former vice president of Ecuador, Jorge Glass, who was seeking political asylum there. And in the midst of all of this, President AMLO, Lopez Obrador of Mexico, has announced that Mexico is severing diplomatic relations with Ecuador because, look, it's one thing to, arrest political opposition, leverage these bribery and corruption charges against him, which true or not, regardless, still an interesting move. But then to just completely violate the whole embassy consulate understanding, it's effectively the same as invading Mexico. Like to violate an embassy or a consulate like that is going against, the sovereign borders of that country. So of course it makes sense that AMLO severs diplomatic relations. But this is very interesting. Of course, Noboa, the president of Ecuador, he clearly ordered this, and he has been leading a sort of Bukele-esque crackdown on gang crime and whatnot. He's been rocking the bulletproof vest, military helmet aesthetic, trying to LARP. I don't know if he's being as successful as Bukele. I don't know if he's as innovative as Bukele, because Bukele also has, the big prison projects and the Bitcoin stuff and all these other things. So, Noboa trying to, I guess, tap into that populist, tough on crime energy. But yeah, I mean, this is a big diplomatic development. And of course, we see the stuff with the consulate in Iran with Israel. It seems that Dimitri was talking about this offline, we may be facing a new world where you are no longer safe as a diplomat in a consulate or an embassy because some of these rules seem to no longer really matter.
Yeah, it's almost as if like there's a breakdown of the Westphalian law sort of system. International relations really is being reduced to sort of really basic interactions, and warfare seems like a almost like a plausible option in a lot of cases where, oh well, diplomacy breaks down, so Venezuela is just going to have a special military operation or a peacekeeping mission in Essequibo or even on Guyana's territory. And I'm not making any puns, but of course not announcing something as a war, and of course taking these sort of operations and peacekeeping deals, which again, this is what the US, NATO actually begun in Serbia and some of the Eastern Bloc countries and former communist countries. So this particular trend was, of course, started and by the Soviets and as in Afghanistan as well. This trend of, well, it's not a war, it's just simply we're sorting out another country's sovereignty for it and kind of tweaking certain things. It's this really deceptive style of international relations sort of action. And yeah, embassies won't be safe when World War III breaks out and you have entire countries and regions of the world, of course, falling to famine and oil prices skyrocket or, of course, drop so substantially because, again, there won't be enough servicing around the world. Imports and exports will be disrupted. I don't think embassies will be these safe havens anymore, unfortunately, for either civilians or even some of these key targets, which, again, took place. This former vice president was apparently a target, so he was just taken out. And it's just really interesting because you mentioned Nayib Bukele, and it's just an interesting sort of guy because, well, this alignment of course, the eclipse happening and, of course, the Bitcoin halving happening very soon in April. We see gold actually, like if you're looking at the markets in general, it's almost like everything's aligning with this weird eclipse, almost like the money changes are, really aligning things here. Gold is reaching an all-time high in price at the moment, really peaking. It looks like people are really investing in gold because they're seeing the fiat currency system, which again, most of the developed world actually uses, based on the US dollar and essentially what you call blood dollars, blood petroleum dollars, with this ancient deal that was made between the United States and the Saudi Arabia and all these other Arabic states in the past. Sort of the petrodollar is falling apart, right? So we are seeing people invest in things like Bitcoin, gold, other currencies, silver, just sort of hedging their bets when things really do go down, and perhaps the US dollar won't be that hedge of currency moving into the future. And, it's really interesting seeing someone like Bukele again offer to assist Haiti with his epic police force and sort of taking care of the cannibals. This sort of project simply, again, may not be possible in this current event, but say World War III breaks out, it may be possible for, for countries to assist one another in these sort of extra curriculum expeditions, just as we saw pre World War One. Maybe we'll be entering this new age of, sort of exploration and like sort of unconventional multilateral and bilateral actions taking place. But yeah, the South America is not doing too well at the moment. The Caribbeans are not looking too good of sort of cannibalism reappearing. It's almost as if that, I would say, well, I don't really want to touch upon this, but Roman Catholicism, this idea of evangelism, quantity over quality project that we saw take place over the last 400 years in South America really hasn't brought around any stability, especially with the sort of infiltration of Freemasonry and things like that. I think they've led to essentially a continent which has been very heavily unstable for the past maybe 200 years, and today it's not looking any better. And naturally, communism, of course, adding into this particular cauldron of events has not, of course, again, assisted the poor South American people of course, with various creeds and colors and ethnicities. But yeah, then again, we are looking for maybe a future where South America will fare a lot better than as it has been doing recently. So it's just very interesting how the world markets really are involved. You mentioned the price of oil as well, like moving up off stream. How again, petrol will probably cost a lot more. So if you're gonna, prior to the eclipse, maybe I mean I'm not going to be some sort of celestial stargazer, but look, if World War III is about to break out, the price of oil is going to maybe double or triple in price almost instantly for the next week. Certain markets will definitely crash, but oil will skyrocket because again, Middle Eastern exports and imports will be drastically affected. And Guyana, the Essequibo region, directly is impacted by that because again, they are major producers of oil and gas and other resources in that region. So all these things should be taken into account, and we've been kind of watching them closely because the world, unfortunately, is very much bound up in this sort of money conundrum, and everything is based around economics on one particular side of the spectrum. So we do need to take these things into account.
Yeah, just to cover a few more bases on some other miscellaneous political issues before we talk about church stuff. Some good news out of Switzerland. The Swiss People's Party, which is very popular, I believe they are the ruling party. They've gotten enough signatures, 100,000 to have a popular referendum on capping immigration in Switzerland so they can have a population of 10 million. They are just past 9.5 million people in Switzerland, so it'd be a very good thing to completely prevent mass migration from a very beautiful, white European country. So hope that we can see that go through. It's a white pill on the immigration front because you go to France and England and these other places, Spain, it's just it's bad. The Great Replacement very real in these urban areas there. So that's one thing. You mentioned, of course, all the eclipse stuff going on. We're gonna maybe do a stream or have at least a lot of posts or something going on during that time, in the midst of all of that afterwards, mostly because of all the Iran stuff that's been in the news. There's all sorts of things apparently. Candace Owens and Ben Shapiro, they were going to debate then, although that was kind of Ben's attempt to goad her. I guess we're going to get a Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens debate on Israel and anti-Semitism soon, so that's all very interesting. But I guess unless you have anything, other miscellaneous news, we have to talk about some of the stuff going on in Greece. Of course, this is good news. The Greek monasteries have banned politicians who voted for gay marriage. They say if we remain silent, we'll also be condemned. This is from Ortho Christian. Those members of the Greek parliament who voted to legalize gay marriage have violated and offended the will of God, thereby calling down judgment upon themselves. And were they to remain silent, they would become complicit and likewise condemned, state the monastic signatories of a new statement concerning the scandalous vote from mid-February. The new statement, full of scriptural references, is signed by the abbots and abbesses and their respective brotherhoods and sisterhoods of 35 monasteries from throughout Greece, including the Athonite monasteries of Zerapotamou, Zakariou, Karakalou, Philotheo, and Konstamanitou. Until they offer their public repentance, the relevant members of parliament are no longer welcome at the signing monasteries, and should they visit of their own accord, they will not be shown any honor. And this comes not too long after Archbishop Hieronymus of Athens celebrated the Sunday of Orthodoxy for the first time in 160 years, so basically for the first time almost in the history of the Hellenic Republic without the Prime Minister of Greece present. I guess, again, Greece is one of the only true almost confessional Orthodox states. Unfortunately, it's a republic, but all of the public office holders, they take an oath, with the church on the Bible and all of these sorts of things. It's orthodoxy is in the Greek constitution. It's why these things are possible, of course. And I'm very grateful to see that the EP and specifically, the Church of Greece, the Autonomous Church of Greece, are really standing strong against this. It's nice to see. We've heard rumors that certain elders have said that the law will be repealed. So I think we can really hope that what good could come of this happening is that Greece could pave the way to show that countries that have already fallen victim to this sodomite nonsense can actually claw it back. They can reverse it, which up till this point has been impossible. I don't know of any country that's repealed gay marriage or all this sodomy stuff. So if Greece could do that, that might have made this whole exercise worth it. You got to experience some hardship and some fire, and then you come out on the other side stronger and lead the way. Because if that doesn't happen, this is going to be used to justify across the whole Orthodox world, specifically Cyprus and Romania being the immediate targets. I'm sure they try to get Georgia eventually, but that seems pretty far off. But yeah, this is very good to see. I don't know if they will move forward with, repealing, if this will have any effect on, the consciences of the MPs and the prime minister involved, but it's very good to see nonetheless.
Yeah, some positive developments, and I guess moving on into the Baltics and some church news. Well, naturally, Ukraine will be touched upon as well, but very curious developments in the Baltic states. We do talk about the fact that Finland celebrates Easter, on the Gregorian calendar and these sort of changes. But Estonian and the Russian Orthodox Church in Estonia, again, is facing immense pressure from the government and the local, I would say, ecumenical patriarchate authorities because, well, it's a very curious situation in Estonia. I guess this is a bit of church history, but Estonia historically, of course, has its Orthodox churches were always under the patronage of the local Russian Orthodox Church. Originally, of course, Russia itself was under the ecumenical patriarchate, but in the 1400s and the 1500s, Russia gained independence, and so Estonia essentially became this Russian sort of, I guess, a place where Russians could evangelize and essentially controlled that area, ecclesiastically speaking. Now, after the Russian Revolution and after Tsar Nicholas II was ritually murdered, all of these events took place. Constantinople, the ecumenical patriarchate, essentially chose to move into Estonia and establish a local Greek community church there. Especially there were a few Greek people living in Estonia for some reason, probably for just commercial purposes. But they established the Ecumenical Patriarchate's Church of Estonia, and which lasted exactly 20 years between, say, 1918 and maybe the beginning of World War II, when the Third Reich, of course, entered into Estonia and took it over. And then all the Greeks fled Estonia and went to Sweden. And so the Greek community, I think, continues in Stockholm as sort of this, not Stockholm syndrome, but the discontinuation of the Greek sort of community which once lived in Estonia. But they left all these empty churches, right? And they even built some additional churches all over Estonia. And this Greek community, these churches were unmanaged. And so when of course, USSR pushed the Third Reich back, they took Estonia back. Of course, Estonia became essentially Russian and Soviet again. The churches all came under the jurisdiction of Russia. And so the Ecumenical Patriarchate agreed. They agreed to give all those churches, they leased them to the Russian church. So officially they said, well, you can lease them for free. You don't have to pay us any rent. But officially they were on this never-ending long-term lease. And now, of course, the Estonian government, seeing as, Estonia is part of NATO and the EU, they're seeing how Russia is conducting itself and how Russia is using, of course, not using, but the Russian Orthodox people are essentially being inspired by the church and some of their saints in order to push back this satanic Western degeneracy. Estonia is seeing the local Russian Orthodox Church in Estonia as a threat. And so they're saying, well, I don't know. They're speaking to these Greek ecumenical patriarchate leaders in their community, and they're saying, look, maybe we could pull that lease back and perhaps start taking Russian Orthodox Christian property and real estate. Because, again, it's all on lease, allegedly, based on these documents going back to like the 1940s. So there's a huge scandal kind of brewing in Estonia at the moment. And this doubled up, unfortunately, with 3 Estonian Orthodox bishops, and these are like Russian Orthodox bishops in Estonia, who, of course, conduct evangelism and missionary works in Estonia. Bishop Lazarus of Narva, Bishop Sergius of Mardu, and Bishop Daniel of Tartu. These 3 bishops were questioned by Estonian MVD, Estonian police, and essentially Estonian feds took them in, interrogated them, and asked them what their opinions were of the SMO and the Russian sort of involvement, what the Russian Patriarchate thinks, because they believe the Russian Patriarchate is their boss, essentially overlooking them. Fortunately enough, the Estonian Metropolitan, the one in charge of all of Estonia, Metropolitan Eugene, was actually on a long-term sort of pilgrimage in Russia at the time, so he couldn't really get involved. So it's interesting how these Baltic states, the governments under NATO and under the EU, are beginning to pressure the Orthodox Church on the basis of, say, Russia officially announcing that this sort of war in Ukraine, this civil war, is a larger civilizational conflict, which is a war of essentially Orthodox Christianity against the Western degenerate Satanism. And it's not to say that Western people are all bad, but simply this particular regime, this hegemony which took over the West, is using Western people as essentially these tools against Christianity, both at home and internationally in Ukraine as well. We also see, of course, Bishop Innocent of Lithuanian Vilnius announce officially that he does not agree with Patriarch Kirill in his support of the SMO. Bishop Innocent was, interestingly enough, at the beginning of the SMO itself, Conrad, he mentioned that he completely supports the SMO, so he's changed this position over the last 2 years, and he even at the beginning of the SMO suspended some priests who didn't want to pray for the victory of Russia and the SMO when that prayer for Holy Rus was announced. So we see bishops in, say, non-Russian territories actually changing their minds or sort of being coerced into it the longer the SMO proceeds. And we saw this sort of pressure on Ukrainian priests and bishops, but also Baltic clergy now are again sort of bending to the will of these powerful state actors, which I can't really blame them, because again, these interrogations and the threats of torture and things like that and harassment, their property being taken away, like it's very hard to sort of stay true to these, I guess, historical real life sort of accounts again. And they're not really asked to sort of abandon Christianity. They're just asked to sort of change their geopolitical opinion, which, again, it's a kind of gray area for some of these bishops. But unfortunately, the worst news comes out of Ukraine, where it's just horrendous footage. Essentially, a Ukrainian priest, his home was raided during, he was having essentially his home was a parish, like a chapel, and during the liturgy, Ukrainian federal agents raided his church. They broke the doors. There was a huge scuffle. People were being beaten, taken outside, handcuffed. The entire footage of Archpriest Yevgeny Vorobyov, the footage of him getting arrested, it's just all out there. Ortho Christian had a really good article, orthochristian.com, covering a particular event covering Archbishop Yevgeny. So we need to keep him in our prayers, because this was like an open, documented case of straight up, I would say, persecution actively in the world taking place. But we do need to keep an eye out on Estonia and the Baltic states, because things are really changing quickly, and who knows what these small Orthodox communities in these former Russian imperial lands will sort of suffer, and what they will endure as the SMO progresses, especially if the SMO doesn't come to an end very soon.
Yeah, we know that 2025 date, stated by the Russians, could be when this thing starts to wrap up. That would somewhat coincide with a big advancement in the next weeks and months. So we hope that this thing can get wrapped up to the point where, the most territory can be gained by the Russian Federation, so the schism can truly be nipped in the bud, and the OCU and the Epiphany Dymenko nonsense can basically just stop existing and fade into obscurity like any other number of schismatic groups, which we can all hope for. Of course, you mentioned the calendar issue earlier. We talked about this before. Patriarch Bartholomew seems committed to using next year's Easter date, that we coincide Easter with the Westerners. This year it's 5+ weeks apart. Our Easter is May 5th. Western Easter is already passed, but next year Pascha and Western Easter will be on the same date, and I believe it'll even be 2 years in a row or something like that. But actually, no, it's been May 5th 2 years in a row. Scratch that. But Patriarch Bartholomew wants to use this as an opportunity to make the dates forever the same. And I mean, I guess that would be cool if for some reason the Catholics decided to adopt the Julian calendar. But I don't know why this matters. He's saying it's like an offense against God to celebrate on different days. It's like, well, they believe in the Filioque, and they bless gay marriages, and they have female Eucharistic ministers, and they believe in papal infallibility. Isn't that an offense against God? What does it matter what these random schismatics, do about Easter? But, that's the 2025 1700th anniversary of Nicaea, trying to get all of that going. So we have to watch out for that. Of course, in some ways, if that occurred, some say it would be beneficial, because you get all of the worst Phanariots and some of the people from Greece and Alexandria and Cyprus to leave, and then all of the best people would stay within Orthodoxy with, basically all of the other patriarchates and autocephalous churches, which, of course, that might be interesting. It would not be ideal. All of those people, we want everybody within the arc of the church. And hopefully, if that does occur sooner rather than later, that, ecumenical council that St. Porphyrios talks about will be able to happen, and will set all of these things right, like he said. But unfortunately, as me and Dimitri say, it seems to be that some of these political and martial, military things may need to occur for the reality of an ecumenical council to come into place. And maybe we'll talk more about this in our upcoming John Vitatzis Marble King episodes, which are upcoming very soon. But Dimitri, unless you have anything else to say about World War III around the world, prophecies, any other fronts we've missed, it's probably about time to wrap this up. I want to make sure everybody remembers to follow World War Now clips. And if you make clips or edits yourself, be sure to send them to me or the World War Now clips channel. And, if it's good and not trash, we'll totally share it. So make some quality clips, edit some things in, put some subtitles on it, and we could share that. But Dimitri, anything else you want to say before we wrap this up and do the other plugs?
Yeah, just the final message. I think Moldova had the right idea by claiming that the Russian black, yellow, and white flag was the main threat to them, and of course their state, and probably I would say all of these degenerate countries which seem to sort of push liberalism and all these sort of anti-Russian, anti-Orthodox ideals in the world. Yes, the Russian imperial monarchist flag and the idea of a nationalist Russian Orthodox empire reaffirming itself with an Orthodox autocratic Tsar at its head will of course destroy not just all these various small schisms, but of course will unite the Orthodox world once again in its sort of, I would say, the secular realm. If one head of the eagle is the church, and the other head, of course, as per Saint Justinian the Great, is the secular power of the emperor, which of course will sort of set worldly affairs in order and of course act as the catechon holding back the Antichrist. This is what these people fear. So Moldova's, it's not correct for banning the flag, but it is correct for fearing it, because again, that is what these people fear the most. They don't. We realize throughout the last 20th century and even 21st century, they don't fear monastics as much. They don't fear, of course, patriarchs. They don't fear clergy as much. But what they really do fear is the return of course, an Orthodox emperor who will reign without any strings attached, without any Hasidic strings attached, without any weird Freemasonic membership club cards like some of these Greek politicians or some of these Russian oligarchs, people like that. There's this completely Orthodox ruler which will independently act and do what's best, not just for the Orthodox Christian people, but even non-Orthodox people around the world. And they're afraid of that sort of subjective political orthodoxy reaffirming itself in world history. And when we do our episodes about the Marble King and some of these prophecies about the future, probably awakening, like the Eups of Ephesus, of this marble Byzantine emperor king, perhaps if that event does take place in our lifetime, we will be reminded of what exactly an Orthodox ruler should be, how an Orthodox ruler should be conducting himself. So I think, on one hand, the Moldovan court decision was upsetting. On the other hand, it's quite a so-called white pill. It's an event of hope that, look, the enemy actually knows what it should fear, and it should fear a new rising Orthodox Russia. Like St. John of Kronstadt said, a strong Russia on an old foundation and a strong foundation. So that's what's coming in the future, and these people are scared of it.
Yeah, I think that's a good place to end. Of course, be praying for peace in all of these regions. In Palestine, of course, as the genocide is ongoing and the Christian population there is very much lingering. We can hope that, perhaps all of this eschatological stuff and the perhaps evil sacrifices of the Palestinians that they're doing to, raise, demonic energy for these things can be stopped. But it's unfortunate, being in America, knowing that all of this is really only happening because my government, allows it to happen and everything. So very unfortunate, but be sure to, stay prayed up, don't spend any time doing weird rituals or focusing too much on the eclipse, say your prayers, do all of these sorts of things. But yeah, thank you so much for listening. worldwarnow.co, worldwarnow.substack.com. Get behind the paywall to help us out. We had that great interview this week with Lucas Gage. That'll be in the link below, so be sure to give it a listen. We have got some other big episodes coming up, big guests, big discussions. We mentioned the Marble King stuff, so be sure to get behind the paywall to get that in your inbox ASAP. Be sure to subscribe to us on YouTube, World War Now. We want to increase our YouTube subscribers, so get that up. Like the video if you're listening on YouTube. Leave a comment, subscribe. All of those things, very helpful. Be sure to follow us on Twitter, _WorldWarNow. Follow me at GnomeRat. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. Again, follow at WWN Clips. Subscribe to them on YouTube as well, World War Now Clips. Be sure to follow us on Rumble, and be sure to follow us on Telegram, World War Now Tele, Tele. We've got all of that stuff going, and we're probably going to start the World War Now Discord pretty soon. So if you want to help out with that, send me a message. If you're interested, let us know in the comments, and we can get you an invite. We're going to have paid and free chats, content and stuff. Maybe do some chats in the Discord. So look forward to that. But with all of that, thank you so much for listening, and God bless.